Thank you, Magda, for both that nice introduction and also for the invitation to come here. I first saw the website when Magda introduced it last fall, I think, at the 16th Century Studies Conference. And I think it's really a wonderful idea to do things this way. I think it's going to be really useful. I've been for a long time an advocate of doing translations both for students and for those of us who like to do comparative history. That sometimes sets people's teeth on edge because they feel that if you don't realize the original languages, you have absolutely no business working in the history of that particular culture. Well, sorry. I teach at a state university and not a first rank one. My students are not going to be learning lots of foreign languages, and I still want them to have the ability to use a lot of original sources as they're doing their work, certainly my undergraduates and occasionally my graduates. And I'm at an age right now where I don't think that I'm going to be learning a whole lot of new languages. My son's trying to convince me to learn Japanese. He promises he'll teach me. He taught me to scuba dive, so maybe he can teach me Japanese. I think scuba diving was easier, certainly quicker than learning Japanese. But I think that, as you know, and I'm preaching to the converted here, that providing translations for people available on the website is really a wonderful resource. And I think that in terms of the aim, as Magda has explained to me, about integrating Jewish history better into the kind of general thrust of the early modern period, that I can't imagine anything that would do that better than exactly what you're doing. So it's really great. All right, that's the end of the cheerleading. One of the marks traditionally associated with modernity is the increasing importance of persons as individuals rather than members of social groups. This really comes as long ago as Jakob Burckhardt, who in the 19th century really created our idea of what the Renaissance was. Burckhardt saw individuality as one of its defining features. He wrote, "In the Middle Ages, man was conscious of himself only as a member of a race, people, party, family, or corporation, only through some general category. In Italy of the Renaissance, man became a spiritual individual." In the century and a half since Burckhardt wrote, his notions of the individualism of the Renaissance and of individualism as a central aspect of modernity have been rejected, rethought, and revised along several lines. Medieval historians, and I imagine there might be a few here, have asserted that the individual was important in learned philosophy, theology, and political theory, as well as popular songs, poems, and stories, at least since the 10th century and maybe even earlier. Conversely, scholars of the early modern period have emphasized that groups of all sorts, families, clans, neighborhoods, guilds, remained extremely important into the 18th century or even into the 21st for many people. This was particularly true for the nobility and for the broad mass of common people, but even among the primary subjects of Burckhardt's study, upper-class Italian Christian men living in cities, corporate groups remained central to their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. Along with these doubts, though, about the individualism of the Renaissance and the early modern period, has come a new interest in aspects of people's lives as individuals that were not part of what concerned Burckhardt. He focused on intellectual and cultural issues among a small group. But more recently, historians have turned their attention to all sorts of people and a much wider range of issues: their physical bodies, their identities as men and women, their sexuality, their experiences with aging, and so on. This newer scholarship on the individual simultaneously broadens and problematizes earlier studies. We now know a great deal more about all kinds of early modern individuals than we did even 20 years ago. But we also recognize how much those individuals were enmeshed in various social relationships and networks of power, and how much they perceived of themselves as members of various groups. This workshop, it strikes me, is very much part of this simultaneous broadening and problematizing. It focuses on a group that was absolutely outside Burckhardt's lens. I probably don't need to say to anybody here, there is not one mention of Jews or Judaism in either of the volumes of the Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. Though, of course, there were lots of Jews in Italy, and lots of the people that Burckhardt does focus on were interested in Judaism. This workshop investigates individuals and tells their stories, but situates these within multiple layers of context: family, clans, neighborhoods, marketplaces, cities. Judging by the text that you've submitted, and what I know of Jewish sources, which is less than all of you do, it uses very traditional sources, like rabbinic commentary, and materials that are not as familiar, which we'll be talking about over the next couple of days. The questions that you are bringing to these sources use gender as a category of analysis, something that was not unthinkable to Burckhardt, who did include a brief chapter titled "The Position of Women" in his book. My students always laugh whenever I say people are talking about the position of women. And you know why they laugh. But your analyses recognize, from what I've read, that gender intersects with other socially constructed lines of difference, such as social class, marital status, urban-rural residence, and of course religion, and that there is no such thing as the position of women, except perhaps in legal theory or other sorts of prescriptive literature. Burckhardt and most other historians since him recognize this diversity for men. Nobody speaks seriously about the position of men in any culture, but not for women. The one line of difference, I might add, in his chapter, his brief chapter on the position of women, that he does address is the variety of women's sexual relationships with men. For that short chapter begins with the wives of rulers, then discusses urban courtesans and mistresses of princes, and ends with a well-footnoted mention of the 6,800 public women of Rome, who he describes as full of, quote, sensuality, greed, hypocrisy, and devilish malice. Discussion, of course, in Burckhardt of men's sexual relationships, by the way, appears only in this chapter. But he doesn't seem to realize that, of course, when he's talking about those public women, he's also talking about men. Burckhardt's Renaissance certainly has no place for men whose sexual relations were with other men, though recent studies by Malcolm Rocky and a host of others have clearly indicated that Renaissance cities were filled with lots of them. But enough about Burckhardt. He's been dead for a long time. I think he's important to kind of go back to, because I think we still sort of, if you think about the popular understanding of the Renaissance, it's right straight out of Burckhardt. Watch the History Channel and you'll find it. I was initially hesitant to give, as Magda can testify, the opening talk for this workshop, for I'm absolutely not a specialist in Jewish history, though I've tried to include more of what I've learned about the Jewish experience when I'm writing broadly about Europe, or at least to be more clear that I'm not including the Jewish experience and identify my statements as pertaining to Christians only. You can try that for a while. It's the same way as if when you first, I think, start to try about always identifying men, so that you decide you're going to say men every time you mean men and describe Michelangelo as a male artist, and you can keep doing this, but you can try to keep adding this. Magda assured me that my lack of expertise was fine, and that what you wanted was general context for many of the issues we'll be discussing throughout the workshop. In providing this context, and especially in doing so in a reasonable amount of time, which I hope I will in this hot room, I will be going against one of the main threads in women's gender and family history over the last several decades, which is the great diversity of experience. Thus, there is no doubt a counterexample somewhere in Europe or among some group for every statement I will make in the next 45 minutes. But that's what keeps us all in business, of course. For if anyone had the absolutely correct and complete story, there would be nothing for the rest of us to say. So what I'm going to do is start with the smallest structure in which people were enmeshed, marriage, and work my way outward. In some cases, I'm able to include comments about Jews, but on many issues, I don't know if their situations would fit the patterns I'm describing or be a counterexample. And I decided not to try to go from the reading that I was doing from your wonderful sources and try to insert it wherever I could. We'll do that over the course of the workshop. I suspect, in fact, though, that the things that you'll be providing will be both counterexamples and reinforcements, for I expect no more generalizations to apply to all Jews than they do to all women. So to marriage. For despite an emphasis on the individual among some thinkers, most 15th and 16th century theorists still conceptualize society as a collection of households, with a marital pair, or what was left as a marital pair, at the core of each household. The choice of a spouse often determined one's social and financial situation, as well as one's personal well-being and happiness, so that marriage was far too important a matter to leave up to young people. Family, friends, and neighbors played a role in finding an appropriate spouse and bringing the marriage to realization. Particularly among the upper classes, there were often complicated marriage strategies to cement family alliances and expand family holdings. On the other end of the economic spectrum, communities and cities in some parts of Europe refused to give marriage permits to people who were too poor. They worried that poor households would need public support and saw marriage as a privilege, open only to those who could afford it. We're back in days of rhetoric of marriage as a privilege, open only to some people, of course. This local restriction of marriage permits became state law in the early 19th century in many parts of Central Europe and lasted until after World War I. There are numerous examples of children and parents who fought bitterly over the choice of a spouse. But in the vast majority of marriages, the aims of the people involved and their parents, kin, and community were largely the same. The best husband was one who could provide security, honor, and status. The best wife was one who was capable of running a household, having children, and assisting her husband in his work. Therefore, even people who were the most free to choose their own spouses, such as widows and widowers, or people whose parents had died, were motivated more by what we would regard as pragmatic concerns than romantic love. This is not to say, though, that their choice was unemotional, and this is something I try to stress to my students all the time, who seem to think there's either arranged marriage or there's marriage for love, and there's never the twain shall meet. But I think it's important to recognize that the need for economic security, the desire for social prestige, and the hope for children were as important emotions as sexual passion. The love and attraction a person felt for a possible spouse could be based on any combination of these, with intense romantic desire often viewed as more likely to be disruptive than supportive of a marriage. Marriage manuals, which become a common genre in the 16th century, and which I know some of the sources we'll be looking at are part of these, they reinforce these ideas. Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish authors agree that the ideal wife was obedient, chaste, cheerful, thrifty, pious, and largely silent, while the ideal husband was responsible, firm, and honorable. Marriage was the clearest mark of social adulthood for both women and men. Craft guilds often required that masters be married, and participation in the governing body of villages or cities was limited to married men. Thus, poor men who were refused marriage permits were also excluded from guild mastership and village decision-making. Marriage gave many women authority over dependent members of the household, including not only children, but also servants, slaves, and in craft households, even apprentices and journeymen. Middle-class urban women also began during the early modern period to redefine what it meant to be a housewife. And maybe this is one of these things, as Magda has asked us to think about what's kind of modern about the early modern period. Maybe this might be one of them. In part, this creation of the role of housewife was a response to their exclusion from productive labor outside of the household, and in part a response to the increased emphasis on the family and marriage, especially in Protestant areas, then to Catholic areas as well. In fact, among Christians, it was the wives of Protestant pastors who were often the leaders in the town in the creation of this expanded domestic role. Medieval urban housewives had had very little time for purely domestic labor. Cooking was simple, cleaning tasks were few, and many domestic tasks, such as baking and laundry, were hired out. This began to change in the 16th and even more in the 17th and 18th centuries, when foodstuffs were more likely to come into households in a less finished state, and middle-class households contained more consumer goods that needed cleaning and care. Of necessity, the time spent by middle-class women on domestic tasks expanded, particularly as things which had been unavailable or unimportant in the Middle Ages, like glass windows, a stone floor instead of a dirt one, several courses at dinner, became important signs of middle-class status. Now, the ideal wife was not simply one who showed religious virtues, such as piety and modesty, but also economic ones, such as order, industriousness, and thrift. We are used to thinking, I think, about the early modern period as a time of growing prosperity among the middle classes. The fruits of that prosperity, what we might term the bourgeois lifestyle, were determined and to a large extent created by middle-class married women. Spouses did not live up to the ideals set for them all the time, of course. I think it's very, very important not to ever think that normative literature is reality. So people regarded it as important to stipulate many legal and financial arrangements within a marriage contract. Marriage contracts were not limited to the wealthy. We're seeing some of these in this workshop as well. But by the 16th century, in some parts of Europe, quite ordinary people, including servants even, had marriage contracts drawn up before they wed. Contracts were especially important in second and third marriages, as they had to stipulate how any inheritance might be divided among all the children. Only after all parties had signed the contract, often including the parents of both spouses if they were still living, could the actual marriage ceremony proceed. Ceremonies varied throughout Europe, but they generally involved some sort of religious ceremony, followed by as expensive a feast as the family could afford. Which in Bruegel's wonderful painting, of course, is two kinds of porridge instead of only one. Just as marriage ceremonies varied according to region, so did marriage patterns. The most dramatic difference was between the area of Northern and Western Europe, including the British Isles, Scandinavia, France, and Germany, and Eastern and Southern Europe. In most of Northwestern Europe, and this is a pattern identified by John Hagenel many years ago, historians have identified a marriage pattern that they've claimed really as unique in the world. I'm hesitant as a person who's becoming increasingly a global historian. Every time anybody says it's unique in the world, I wince. But so far, it seems to be holding up. The marriage pattern of couples waiting until their mid or late 20s to marry, long beyond the age of sexual maturity, and then immediately setting up an independent, nuclear, neo-local household. Husbands were likely to be only 2 or 3 years older than their wives at first marriage, and though households often contained servants, they rarely contained more than one family member who was not part of the nuclear family. And I'd like to reiterate, I think, the particularly unusual, the thing that's most unusual about this marriage pattern is the older age of marriage for women. That's the thing that seems to be the most unusual of this somewhat unusual marriage pattern. In most of the rest of the world, including Southern Europe, most of Eastern Europe, and a few parts of Northwestern Europe, such as Ireland, marriage was between teenagers who lived with one set of parents for a long time, or between a man in his late 20s or 30s and a much younger woman, with households again containing several generations. And there's all kinds of different kind of combinations of multi-generational households, multiple families, households, stem families with the father and one son, Parishes, which is two brothers living together with their households, but some kind of multiple complex household. There were regional and class variations from these patterns. In southern Italy and southern Spain, nuclear families were more common than complex families, which was also true among agricultural wage laborers in Hungary and Romania. Marriage among Jews in Northwestern Europe tended to be, at least this is what seems to be the situation that people have identified so far, earlier for both spouses than among Christians, but about the same as in Southern and Eastern Europe. In the 40 years since the demographer John Hagenel first identified these two family patterns, however, most research has supported his division. Nobody knows why it happened, though. Historians are not sure why this pattern has developed, and its consequences are easier to trace than its causes. Its consequences include fewer total pregnancies for women, though not necessarily fewer surviving children, a greater level of economic independence for newlyweds, who had often already spent long periods as servants or workers in other households, saving money and learning skills. More people who never married at all. In Southern and Eastern Europe, most of the unmarried Christian population lived in convents or monasteries. But in Northwestern Europe, this group was far too large for that, even before the Protestant Reformation led to the closing of most monastic institutions. Demographers estimate that between 10 and 15% of the Northwestern European population never married at all in the early modern period, and that in some places, in some eras, this figure may have been as high as 25%, at least among Christian urban populations. This may be one reason that most laws restricting unmarried people come from Northern Europe. And the continuity in these laws indicates, continuity in the patterns indicates the laws were never very effective. One of the key ideas of the Protestant Reformation, of course, was the denial of the value of celibacy and the championing of married life as the spiritually preferable state. One might thus expect religion to have had a major effect on marriage patterns. But this is very difficult to document, and in fact, people don't seem to be investigating it, in large part because all of the areas of Europe that became Protestant lie within Northwestern Europe. So you have this pro-marriage ideology, but you have economic and social structures that mitigate against this. There are a number, though, of important theoretical differences between Protestants and Catholics in terms of marriage. Protestant marriage regulations stress the importance of parental consent more than Catholic ones. and allowed the possibility of divorce with remarriage for adultery or impotence, and in some areas also for refusal to have sexual relations, deadly abuse, abandonment, or incurable diseases such as leprosy. Orthodox law in Eastern Europe allowed divorce for adultery or the taking of religious vows. The numbers of people of any Christian denomination who actually used the courts to escape an unpleasant marriage were very small, however, and apparently everywhere smaller than the number of couples who informally divorced by simply moving apart from one another with no kind of formal recognition of this. In parts of Europe where this has been studied, women more often used, much more often in fact, used the courts to attempt to form a marriage. In other words, in a breach of promise case, they come in and said, "We're really married," or to renew a marriage in which their spouses had deserted them, than to end one. The impossibility of divorce in Catholic areas was mitigated somewhat by the possibility of annulment, and by institutions which took in abused and deserted wives, and by the possibility of separation of board and table, a mensa a thoro. As you know, Jewish law allowed divorce for a number of reasons, including incompatibility. In theory, the agreement of both spouses was needed. This is also the case with Orthodox Christian in Eastern Europe if people wanted to get a divorce for religious vows. And the economic division of assets was to be based in Jewish law on each spouse's behavior. That's the theory. Early modern Jewish marriage literature, which we're reading again, describes the ideal match as one predestined in heaven. So divorce could be justified on the grounds that the spouses had obviously not been predestined for one another. It was kind of a mistake. Muslim law allowed a man to divorce his wife at any time, though he was required to continue supporting her. Wives seeking divorce, which in theory in Muslim law is not allowed, and it shows up in the courts all the time, if the wife sought the divorce in Muslim law, she gave up her right to this support. Muslim law also allowed a man to have 4 wives, but polygamy was relatively uncommon in the Muslim parts of the Iberian Peninsula or in the Ottoman Empire. Very uncommon, in fact. Place of residence and social class had a larger impact than religion on marital patterns. Throughout Europe, rural residents married earlier than urban ones and were more likely to live in complex households of several generations or married brothers and their families living together. They also remarried faster and more often. Women from the upper classes married earlier than those from the lower, and the age difference between spouses was greatest for upper class women. Women who had migrated in search of employment married later than those who remained at home and married someone closer to their own age. So though sort of looking at the early modern period from the outside, you would think that religion would be the most important determinant of marriage patterns. It turns out, in fact, not to be so, and to be other things. Along with significant differences, though, there were also similarities in marriage patterns throughout all of Europe. Women of all classes and religions were expected to bring a dowry to their marriage, which might consist of some clothing and household items, often the marriage bed and bedding for poor women, or vast amounts of cash, goods, or property for wealthy women. In Eastern Europe, the dowry often included serfs and slaves. The size of the dowry varied by geographic area and across time, as well as by social class. In 15th and 16th century Florence, for example, dowries required for a middle or upper class woman to marry grew staggeringly large, and families placed many of their daughters in convents instead of trying to find husbands for them, because convent entrance fees, which could be quite high, were much lower than dowries. The dowry substituted in most parts of Europe for a daughter's share of the family inheritance, and increasingly did not include any land, which kept land within the patrilineal lineage. Laws regarding a woman's control of her dowry varied throughout Europe, but in general, a husband had the use, technically, but not the ownership of it during his wife's lifetime. Though, of course, if he invested it unwisely, the distinction didn't matter at all. Women could sue their own husbands if they thought they were wasting their dowries, however. And courts in many areas sided with the women, taking control of the dowry out of the husband's hands. This was clearly something done only as a last resort, however, as it meant a woman had to admit publicly that her husband was a drunkard or a wastrel or a spendthrift or something else like that. During the late medieval period, women appear to have been able freely to bequeath their dowries to whomever they chose. But in many parts of Europe, this right was restricted during the 16th century to prevent them from deeding property to persons or institutions other than the male heirs. So in fact, there's some interesting cases of women siding with Catholic clergy coming out sounding very pro-feminist, saying, oh, these women are really smart and they should have complete control over their own property and da-da-da. It's because, of course, women had been deeding it to the church rather than to their brother or to their male heir. Strange people become pro-feminist when they want the money. Marriage brought a husband and wife not only into a relationship with one another and their eventual children, but also into a broader web of family and kin relations. In the 1970s, and there's some around here I see who are old enough to remember all of this, several historians, including Lawrence Stone, posited a dramatic change in the early modern era, from a traditional complex family in which broader kinship networks were important to a modern family in which the nuclear family was central and kin neither interfered nor helped very much. Well, in contrast to Hagenel's geographic division of European family structures, this chronological division between the traditional complex family and the modern nuclear one has not stood up very well in subsequent research. One line of criticism has come from demographers and economic historians, investigating family and household structures and composition, using sources such as marriage and death registers, birth or baptism records, poll tax surveys, land transfer records, and other types of legal documents. So it's from people figuring out how things actually were, not how Lawrence Stone thought they were. The Cambridge Group for the History of the History of Population and Social Structure, founded in '64 by now the late Peter Laslett and now Sir Anthony Wrigley, has developed techniques of family reconstitution by linking all the records of a small group of people over time. Their work has produced detailed statistics and longitudinal analyses about such issues as nuptiality, age at marriage, remarriage, fertility, infant and child mortality, and longevity. And those of you who love numbers know the Cambridge Group's work, I'm sure, very well. Currently, scholars from the Cambridge Group are using early modern demographic data to look at very specific questions, a really quite complicated question, including the ways in which shocks experienced in the uterus, such as maternal famine, might have affected longevity. The records are so good for some of these English villages that they can literally go from a famine, figure out exactly children born when the mother had experienced the famine, and then go on and track how long those children lived compared to children from the same mother who were not born during the time of a famine. These are great documents. Most of us don't have such documents. And other things like the way that a position in the family as oldest, middle, or youngest child might have affected infant mortality. Trying to kind of get at a sense about was there kind of parental favoritism toward one or another child. They have discovered that at least in many parts of England, nuclear families predominated as a living arrangement as early as the 13th century, while kin networks remained important in many matters, such as land transfers and property ownership, far into the 19th century, even if kin did not reside in the same household. Sadly, the detailed sources on which the Cambridge Group relies are not available for most other parts of Europe until much, much, much later, really in the 20th century for many places, if then. But historians and demographers working with local records have found at least suggestions of this pattern outside of England as well. I mean, many of the questions they deal with we will simply never be able to answer for other parts of Europe in the early modern period, but occasionally we can. Historians working in other areas have discovered that the proportion of people who lived in complex households actually increased rather than decreased during the period. In Russia, this increase was the result of the spread and sharpening of serfdom, which might be seen as a mark of this area's economic and social backwardness, thus making the expansion of the more traditional family form not very surprising. So it kind of fits the old Stone model, the Russian case. But in parts of Western Europe, larger households resulted from the spread of industrial work or proto-industrial work, especially in textiles, into rural areas, which is regarded by economic historians as a sign of economic development. So economic development in some parts of France in particular leads to much larger, more complex households, which is not what we would have had expected. Proto-industrialization, though, in England and Switzerland led to earlier marriage, smaller and more nuclear households, and more unmarried women and widows living on their own. So I think sort of taking all these demographic and legal records together, what this has done is led most historians to emphasize variability in household structures and in the importance of kin, rather than any uniform pattern of change for all of Europe or even for all of Western Europe. So, along with debates about family structure, historians have also debated the role of the emotions in early modern family life. Some argue that the modern family, in which couples choose their own spouses, based on romantic sentiments rather than parental or community preferences, and in which strong emotional bonds developed between parents and children originated in the 18th century. Lawrence Stone has been part of this, so has Edward Shorter, so originally was Arias, and a bunch of other people. Before then goes this line of thought. Family interactions were cold, mothers indifferent to their infants, siblings jealous of the power of the oldest brother, parents callous toward their children's wishes, and spouses formal and uncaring in their relations with one another. Family life in this model was viewed as particularly grim for children, which began with the work of Philip Arias. Childhood, Arias and others have argued, was not recognized as a distinct stage in life until at least the late 18th century, and children were raised harshly or regarded with indifference. You'll find this repeated again, by the way, along with Burkhardt on the History Channel. These views were derived largely from child-raising manuals that advocated strict discipline and warned against coddling or showing too much affection, and portraits of children that showed them dressed as little adults. This bleak view, though, has been relieved somewhat in the last several decades by scholars using archival sources about the way children were actually treated. They've discovered that many parents showed great affection for their children and were disturbed, sometimes to the point of madness or suicide, when they died young. Parents tried to protect their children with religious amulets and pilgrimages to special shrines, made toys for them, sang them lullabies. My favorite thing is put them in walkers, in wheeled walkers, so that they can move around easily around the household, which is now, of course, seen as a terribly dangerous thing. We shouldn't use wheeled walkers and things, but I think they were really wonderful in the 15th century. Even practices, in fact, which to us might seem cruel, such as tight swaddling, were motivated by a concern for the child's safety and health at a time when most households had open fires, domestic animals wandered freely, and mothers and older siblings were engaged in productive work, which prevented them from continually watching a toddler. The work of Barbara Hannawald in England has pointed out how often children die by falling into wells, falling into ditches, falling into holes in the road, other sorts of accidental drownings. Swaddling at least keeps calling infants out of animal droppings and from drowning in holes. Just as they've disputed whether the early modern period had a clear concept of childhood, historians have also disagreed about whether there was a notion of adolescence. Once again, I think, though, the trend has been to find more and more evidence that they did, although this varied across space and time, and actually also across gender. Some authors, early modern authors, divided adolescentia from juventes, so sort of adolescence from youth, seeing the former, adolescence for boys at least, as a time of raging lusts and wild behavior, and the latter as a juventes as a subsequent stage when young men learned to control their actions and carried out their final preparations for adult responsibilities, including marriage. Physical maturing occurred in stages for men, as did maturing in legal and political terms. Generally, Christian boys who were 14 could usually marry, make contracts of apprenticeship for themselves, or enter universities, though they couldn't inherit land unless they were a ruler. A number of different rituals served to mark passage into adulthood for boys, though for European girls there are very few rites of passage. Now, there's plenty of qualitative evidence to support all sides of these various arguments. Cold versus affectionate families, childhood versus no childhood, adolescence versus no adolescence. But because the sources are primarily personal documents, they are limited in total number, skewed toward the upper classes, and may not reveal people's real feelings in any case. I don't know if when you were an adolescent, you wrote your parents your true feelings about things or communicated them on a daily basis, but probably not. My adolescents certainly don't, at least judging by what's on their MySpace web pages, and I don't imagine adolescents in the 16th century did at all. The quantitative evidence relating to families that does exist is also open to widely varying interpretations. Here's a couple of examples. Age at first marriage for women in Western European cities appears to have declined in the 18th century, especially among the poorer classes. We find it in German cities, in English cities, in French cities. So that's a demographic, well, fact, if we still believe there are any. What? How do we interpret this? Does this mean that young women who had left their villages for larger towns in search of employment were reveling in their ability to choose a husband based on love, rather than having to go along with their parents' wishes? That's Edward Shorter's interpretation of earlier age at marriage. Or does it mean that they unemotionally assessed their opportunities for wages compared to those of men and grabbed the first likely prospect of a husband, realizing they would never earn enough to support themselves on their own. A rather cold-hearted or cold-eyed view of their opportunities, not romance. Similarly, do high numbers of children left at orphanages or foundling homes mean that poor mothers were uncaring? We know, we can count the numbers, we know that this happened. Or does it mean that they were willing to put the chances for survival of their children ahead of their own feelings? You've got the number, what do you make with it? These debates have made most scholars careful about extrapolating from their own research to making generalizations that apply to all of Europe, or even to all social classes within one country. But by and large, I would say, the scholarly consensus has swung in favor of more continuity than dramatic change in familial and parental love and affection. There does seem to have been, so maybe there's not something so distinctive about the early modern period on that. There does seem to have been an increase in a desire for privacy among middle and upper class families, both privacy for the family as a unit, separated from the rest of the world, and privacy from other family members within the household. Thus, for households that could afford it, servants increasingly had separate quarters, and rooms within houses were more compartmentalized, with doors that could be closed. Privacy, of course, never extended to lower class families in either theory or practice. Poor people living in cities live in very crowded quarters, renting a tiny attic or a cellar room for an entire family, continuing to share beds and eating utensils. Local communities, as I commented earlier, sometimes refused to allow poor people to marry, as they worried that poor families would require public support. Emotional relationships were no excuse for burdening the community coffers. This control of marriage becomes state law in some of the territories within the Holy Roman Empire in the early 19th century, with political authorities describing marriage explicitly as a privilege available only to those who are economically solvent. It's World War I, by the way, that lifted some of those restrictions. Just as household structure varied, so too did inheritance laws, traditions, and patterns, which do not seem to have correlated with family structure very well either. It would be really nice if we could say everywhere there were nuclear families, we had primogeniture, we had and everywhere there are complex families, it was dividable inheritance. It doesn't work at all. In general, inheritance is either partible, so in which the total estate's divided among all the children, or at least among all the sons, or impartible, in which one child, usually the eldest son, inherits all the land, and if they're aristocrats, the noble title. So there's sort of two general inheritance schemes, kind of. In areas with impartible inheritance, younger sons and daughters received a settlement in cash or goods, but this was almost never equal to the value of the oldest son's patrimony. Impartible inheritance means that family property stayed intact from generation to generation. It's very beneficial that way. But also that the lives and prospects of eldest sons were very different from those of their younger brothers and sisters. And some of the sophisticated research of the Cambridge group has been trying to figure out eldest sons in parts of England that still have impartible inheritance. There are a few left, and just sort of trying to see how that fits with, how birth order fits with inheritance strategies or inheritance systems. Partible inheritance could lead to impoverishment as family holdings became smaller and smaller. And gradually, throughout the early modern period, many areas with partible inheritance practices changed their laws to adopt impartible systems. With much fanfare about this usually, it's also, though, true that it happens more in legal theory than it does in reality. So in theory, an area sometimes has a partible inheritance system, an impartible inheritance systems, but in practice it's still partible because they've been doing that for generations. This change is not smooth and ever uncontested, and any change in inheritance laws provoke conflicts among legal authorities as well as individual cases challenging the change. Certain aspects of inheritance, such as the rights of individuals to make donations, were governed by church law for Christians, so that ecclesiastical as well as secular officials frequently weighed in with opinions and objections. And we're seeing this also in the sources that you're providing for this workshop, too, how ecclesiastical authorities get mixed in with all this inheritance stuff. Inheritance provoked bitter conflicts, even in areas with one clear system, for laws rarely covered every possible combination of multiple spouses, stepchildren, half-siblings, cousins, half-cousins, and on, or clearly set out the limits to which an individual could get around local traditions and choose heirs as he or she wished. The vicious hostility among family members that emerge in the often voluminous legal records of such cases provide evidence for historians arguing that early modern families were cold and unpleasant. But arguments about money that have ended up in court are not likely to show families in any era in their best light. Demographers and historians of family emotion have provided strong criticism of the model of a traditional extended family evolving into a modern nuclear one. And scholars interested in changes in ideas about the family and the meaning of family life have raised still more questions. They take issue not only with the Stone thesis of set points of change, but also with the methods and conclusions of the demographers. Just because early modern records were structured according to households, they ask, how do we know that co-residence had the same meaning for family members in the 16th century that it did in the 19th? One indication that it did not is the fact that co-resident relatives, cousins, nieces, nephews, or sometimes even sisters and brothers, are often referred to as servants by the household head and the census taker, though they might still have called the whole group a family. So here's the household head, here's his wife, here's children, but then here's these other people who sometimes are family members. Scholars interested in such questions how do we know which genealogical ties were significant? Just because they're there in a census record or they're there in some kind of a legal document, did they mean anything to people? Maybe other sorts of networks might have mattered more than something a census taker took note of. Might the significance of family and kin connections be different for women, who are often understood to be part of two families, than for men, or for oldest sons than for younger ones? Scholars interested in such questions have made extensive use of private family records, prescriptive literature such as sermons and advice manuals, letters and wills, to investigate the way that people thought about or acted regarding their families, to try to kind of make meaning out of these family relationships. A key finding of these studies is that, in fact, the word family was actually used very rarely in the 16th century, perhaps because it had so many different meanings. Shakespeare, for example, only used it 9 times in all of his writings. Now we can do this computer-assisted Shakespeare studies. We know how long, if you want to go onto the websites, you can find out how often he used any word that you want to know about. But family, the word family, 9 times in all of his writings, and never once in Romeo and Juliet. The Montagues and Capulets are described always as houses, not as families. Similar feuds and the group loyalty that made them possible can be found in many areas of Europe, centering on groups that we usually call clans in English. Clans, and these are words like consorteria in Italy, or plemi in Poland, Slachte in northern Germany, fis in Albania. Clans, to use that word, thought of themselves as having a common ancestor, but they usually didn't worry about how they were actually related to one another, and generally had methods of incorporating non-kin for political or economic reasons. Clans offered their members military support, political patronage, and economic advantages, and usually had ceremonies and symbols denoting clan membership. Both Burckhardt's idea of the rise of the individual and the Stone thesis about the rise of the nuclear family suggest that such clans were unimportant by the 16th century, but this was true for only a few parts of Europe. Until the 18th century, fiefs in parts of the Balkans functioned as fighting units, and Slachte in northern Germany provided fire and accident insurance only for clan members. Of course, right smack in the middle of the 18th century, Scottish clans rebelled, well, unsuccessfully, of course, against George II, seeking to put Bonnie Prince Charlie on the Scottish throne. But clans are not only Scots. Thus, broad kinship ties retained their power for many people, even if they weren't exactly sure how they related genealogically with the group. You wore that tartan, but how you exactly fit into all these people, you might not have known. Until very late in the early modern period, and perhaps not even then, a person's name would not have provided any clear indication of kin connections or family membership. The modern Western naming system of an individual first name and a hereditary family surname seems to have developed, and historians of names debate this a lot, so you may have followed this debate, but seems to have developed first among wealthy families in Italian towns in the 12th and the 13th centuries. But this practice of having a first name and then a surname spread very, very slowly. By the 16th century, the nobility of most of Europe had surnames, often taken from the place where they owned land, or in Scandinavia, the signs on their heraldic shields. My favorite is Axel Oxenstierna, the 17th century Swedish chancellor, that is Axel Oxhead, or Ox Forehead, actually. Slowly, common people, especially those attempting to improve their status, adopted surnames from all kinds of things, as we know, occupations, physical characteristics, father's name, mother's name, place of residence, or some other distinguishing feature. These slowly became heritable rather than changing with each generation, a process speeded up by church and state authorities who saw that such a system would make record keeping and tax collection easier. So in some ways, this drive to have heritable surnames comes from above. In 1539, Francis I of France ordered all families to adopt a permanent surname in the territory he ruled. Now, it took a couple centuries for that to happen, but in theory, in 1539. Similar ordinances, though, weren't passed in Denmark until 1771 and in Austria until 1776. Peasants were generally the last to adopt permanent surnames, and in Iceland and a few parts of Scandinavia, surnames never became heritable, and are, of course, not heritable in Iceland till today. Women in most part of Europe kept their own surnames on marriage until the 18th and the 19th century, so that this is another thing. Gender in surnames is a very, even more complex process. Though Christian women would often be identified in legal documents as wife of so-and-so. People who would analyze this point out that in general, Jewish women tend to be more often identified as daughter of so-and-so, even if they're married, whereas Christian women are identified as wife and so-and-so in comparative things, but not invariably in both cases. Jewish men often generally learn, as you know, the name of their father as an identifier, as do Muslim men in the Ottoman Empire. Prominent men and Muslim men might add the name of their grandfather and sometimes a long string of male ancestors to their names in certain situations, but people's names also change depending on what situation they're in. So the name that a person uses in a legal document might be very different than the name that they happen to use somewhere else. Clans were not the only type of group in which genealogical connections blended with non-kin ties. With the gradual adoption of infant baptism in late antiquity, Christians introduced the practice of godparentage, in which adults other than the parents sponsor a child at baptism. This creates a spiritual bond between the godparents and the child, and between the parents and the godparents. In canon law, relatives by blood or marriage are prohibited from marrying. By the 15th century, this prohibition had been extended to 7 degrees of kinship, which meant kind of roughly that individuals that shared a great-grandparent, in theory, were not supposed to marry. It's kind of how it works. You have to count up and count down in kinship, so it's a complicated thing. But roughly, people who shared a great-grandparent. This prohibition began to then extend to spiritual kinship as well, so that marriage between a godparent and a godchild was forbidden, as was that between a godparent and a natural parent, and even between, in theory, 2 unrelated godparents of the same child. That then, if they have sexual relations, it's then incest. This last prohibition was often, however, completely ignored, especially as the number of godparents, especially in wealthy families, multiplied in the 15th century, so you had 15 godparents, and it was hard to find anybody that you could legally marry. In some parts of Europe, blood relatives were usually chosen as godparents, with children sometimes serving as godparent to younger kin. Sometimes 7- and 8-year-olds are godparents. Peasants in England, France, and Germany more often chose a local notable rather than kin, hoping that he or she might provide patronage or protection for the child later in life. Protestants limited the prohibited degrees of kinship in terms of marriage for blood relatives and in-laws, and rejected completely the idea that spiritual kinship should create any sort of barrier to marriage. Most Protestants retained the practice of godparentage, though, but limited the number of godparents and emphasized their spiritual rather than their practical importance. The bonds between whole families created by godparentage became more significant in Southern and Catholic Europe than they become in the North. Along with godparentage, Christians were often linked through confraternities, voluntary lay groups organized by occupation, devotional preference, neighborhood, or charitable activity. Confraternities expanded rapidly in larger cities and many villages with the growth of the mendicant orders, such as the Franciscans and Dominicans in the 13th century. Some confraternities specialized, praying for souls in purgatory, either for specific individuals or for the mass of everybody in purgatory. In England, confraternities are usually associated with a single parish, so sometimes they're called parish guilds. If you do English history, you might know them as parish guilds or parish lights, they're sometimes called. By the late Middle Ages, these parish guilds hold dances, ales, and collections to raise money to clean and repair church buildings. and to supply the church with candles, altar cloths, and other liturgical objects. Luckily for historians, parish guilds also leave records, so we know something about them. Membership in a confraternity or a parish guild gave individuals spiritual, social, and charitable benefits, and in the case of male confraternities limited to members of the elite, it provided political ones as well. It's a kind of skull and bones club of the 15th, 16th centuries. Before the Reformation in the English town of Coventry, for example, only men who were members of the Trinity confraternity, the Trinity Guild, could hold an office in city government. In 16th century Portugal, nobles and other wealthy men were often members of the Misericordia confraternities that monopolized most charitable activities and gained the support of the monarchy. Most men in confraternities were not members of the elite, of course, but the groups still gave them regular opportunities to reinforce their devotional life, express their faith outwardly, assist others, and get together with their peers. Across Europe, women had fewer opportunities to establish, join, or lead confraternities than did men. They appear more often as beneficiaries of the confraternity's generosity than they do as members. For some confraternities provided dowries that would allow poor girls to marry or enter a convent, or they opened institutions for repentant prostitutes, called convertiti, or they opened asylums for women who were felt to be at risk of turning to prostitution or losing their honor. So confraternities in Italy in particular opened houses for girls who they suspected might otherwise turn to prostitution or were otherwise threatened. Some of those, interestingly, of those houses limit their entrance to good-looking girls because ugly ones had no fear for their honor. It's a rather famous little comment. Occupational groups such as craft guilds and journeymen's guilds provided additional opportunities for men, and in a few cases for women, to associate with their brothers, so that by the 16th century, a good share of the urban population would have been part of one fraternal organization or another, or perhaps several different groups at the same time. And I'm really pleased the way you conceptualize this whole workshop is to sort of look at family and gender roles within this kind of broader social context of other kinds of community networks, because I think there's been a kind of many different kind of schizoid look at either the family or these other groups and not really seeing them as kind of webs that interweave. Both religious and occupational groups carried out tasks together, but they also offered opportunities during festivals and holidays to socialize and break up the daily routine of work and organized much of people's leisure activity. For some people, religious or occupational groups augmented strong kin ties, while for others, they may have offered an alternative to reliance on blood relatives. Neighbors and friends provided still more opportunities for association, assistance, and economic exchange, though these have left far fewer traces in the sources than family connections or formal associations. Trying to figure out how the way that people's neighborhood networks work is really difficult. In fact, relations with neighbors generally make it into the records only when they broke down, when legal authorities are called in to reconcile disputes. These informal communities were clearly significant, however, for the early modern world was not a private one. Neighbors moved easily in and out of one another's homes and took an unabashed interest in one another's affairs. We find this lots in Inquisition records, particularly those having to do with sex, that often start out, I was looking in my neighbor's window and I saw. And it goes on. Neighborhood and friendship networks could provide daily support as well as help in extraordinary circumstances like war, death, arrest, or natural catastrophe. All of these groups, from marriage and the family outward to the larger groups, created webs of obligation, reciprocity, emotion, and dependence, and helped individuals understand and negotiate the wider world through every stage of life. Men and women progressed up and down the great staircase of the world, a common theme in early modern prints and paintings, as individuals, but on each step on the great staircase of life, most of them also saw themselves and were viewed by others as parts of various groups. Even death did not change this, for the living were obliged to memorialize the dead with whom they had connections. Along with this sense of membership, families, guilds, and religious organizations also provided people with their most intimate experiences of relationships of power. For even the more egalitarian of these, such as religious communities of monks or nuns, had hierarchical structures of authority and leadership. All of these local groups formed the basis for broader hierarchies of power, such as cities, territories, nations, and states. Thus, Burckhardt's comment that, quote, in the Middle Ages, man was conscious of himself only as a member of a race, people, party, family, or corporation, only through some general category, unquote, clearly applies to early modern man as well, and perhaps even more so to early modern woman, who often understood herself as belonging to two families at once, though she was less often a formal member of corporate groups, such as guilds or confraternities. The last 30 years of research on the family, on women, and on gender have not only led us to question the trajectory of growing individualism, they have also led us to reject the way I just phrased that last sentence. There was no such thing as medieval man or early modern woman. Women's and men's experiences were shaped by intersecting categories of difference, race, class, and gender, of course, but also sexual orientation, age, religion, marital status, geographic location, able-bodiedness, and on and on and on. Someone once said, in heaven you get to think about only one thing at a time. We're not in heaven. The categories themselves are historically constructed and culturally variable, of course, often assuming clear lines of distinction or dichotomies when there were none. I think the controversy, for example, about conversos in Spain, both in the early modern period and among modern historians, seems a perfect example of this. Are they Jews? Are they not Jews? What does a Jew mean? What do all these categories mean? We think we have a dichotomy. We think there's just men and women, and everything is not dichotomous. In fact, of course, even the categories women and men are misleading and incomplete. These dichotomous gender categories not only ignore individuals who are morphologically or psychologically do not belong to either of these groups, a topic of great interest among everybody under age 30 these days, certainly if you read the journals. But also, I think, this dichotomous gender category of men and women ignore the way that certain morphologically male or female persons were not conceptualized as men or women. That is, they did not or could not behave in ways that were considered acceptably masculine or feminine. This workshop will only further complicate these categories, of course, focusing on a group that is often omitted from discussions of early modern Europe, even those much newer than Burckhardt, or marginalized in much the same way that women have been. Sometimes, of course, if you look at books, this marginalization is literal, with both Jews and women put in text boxes with comparable headings. Jews in Renaissance Italy, sort of off to the side. Women in the Reformation, off to the side, in a box. I'm eager to hear which of the generalizations I've just rattled off will bite the dust, but I also hope that this broad context will be a useful starting point for our discussion. Thanks.